Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. These are the 5 stages of grief, created by Elisabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969, and in the last 50 years, it's become a widely known model for how people process loss. But there's a common misconception that all people experiencing grief go through each of those 5 stages, and in that order. In fact, in her book, Kubler-Ross is very clear that people can experience these stages in any order, and sometimes can bounce between different stages multiple times. But as the years went on, this incorrect narrative that the 5 stages of grief happen in this particular sequence took hold in the culture. I imagine that when Kubler-Ross was first told about this, at first she must have been in total denial that her work could be misinterpreted this way. Because she's so clear in her book, the model's not linear. And then she got really angry that her research was being so misunderstood. And then she thought to herself, well, maybe if I write more books and go on TV, then people will understand my message. And then when that didn't work, she fell into a great despair. But then eventually she reached a place of acceptance. I share this as a reminder that models like the 5 stages of grief can be helpful to most people most of the time, but they aren't perfect. Even the best models sometimes don't work for a given individual in a particular circumstance. And that's also true of the Jewish model of grieving. People like to say that Jews do death well, that the stages of Aninut and Shiva and Shloshim and Yortzeit are about moving you through the grief process so that you can re-enter real life and gradually adjust to your new normal. But that model, as great as it is, it doesn't always work, especially if you focus more on the steps and less on the actual grieving. In fact, in this week's Parsha, Chayei Sarah, after the death of Sarah, you see not 1 but 3 models for how to process the loss of a loved one. The first comes from Avraham, whose practices of how he mourned for his wife is where we get the basic structure of Jewish burial and mourning, and it takes all of 7 Hebrew words. Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sara v'livchota vayakam Avraham. Avraham gave her a eulogy. He cried, and he got up. He got up from Shiva. Check, check, check. And then he went about the tasks of returning to real life. Burial as soon as possible, finding a wife for his son Yitzchak, and then himself remarrying. It's not my intention here to be dismissive. This is the successful outcome of the Shiva model. You have a series of steps that you follow to serve as guideposts as you work your way through the darkness, and eventually they bring you out to the other side. It's beautiful, and it's powerful, and it seems like it worked for Avraham. The second model comes from Yitzhak, who you'll notice is not mentioned as being at the funeral, nor is he present when his father's servant goes about the process of finding a wife for him. When we next see him in this parsha, he's described as being in the vicinity of Be'er Lachai Roi, somewhere off the map, off the grid, in the middle of the desert. What was he up to at this time, during this time in the wilderness? Traditionally, that verse is used to claim that Yitzchak was engaged in private prayer, that he was inventing Mincha, our afternoon prayer service. And in fact, the students of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov cited these verses about Yitzchak meditating in the wilderness when they developed the concept of hitbodedut, of contemplation and prayer in the middle of the woods or some other quiet and remote spot where it's just you, your thoughts, and the conversation that you want to have with God. And that's the second model of grief, going inward, taking space to sit with your memories, thinking about the blessings that that person has brought to your life, asking God the big questions about life and death. And unlike Shiva, which in its fullest capacity requires a minyan, this model of hitbodedut, of seclusion in the face of grief, is something that you do alone. The third model can be seen in the very last verse of chapter 24, when Yitzchak, having left his place of seclusion, sees his new wife Rivka for the first time. It says in Hebrew, Vayviea Yitzchak ha'ola Sarah imo, vayikach et Rivka, vathilo la'isha, vaye'avea, v'yinachem Yitzchak acharei imo. Yitzchak then brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he took Rivka as his wife. Yitzchak loved her, and thus found comfort after his mother's death. This verse is the first time in the Torah where it says that a man loves a woman, the very first case of romantic love. So we know that this verse is important. And I think the order of operations here is instructive. First it says, Vayviea. Yitzchak opened up the tent, opening up what had been closed since his mother's death. Then it says, Vayavea. He's able to love, to experience joy again. And then it says he was able to find comfort after loss. In other words, that experience of feeling joy and comfort only came after he opened up his tent. And I think it's not a coincidence that the words Vayviea and Vayavea are almost perfect anagrams. You can't spell one without the other. You can't have one without the other. You can't have real love without truly opening up emotionally. And so if the first model of processing grief is the traditional steps of Shiva, and the second model is self-seclusion and contemplation, then the third model of processing grief is opening up, sharing your feelings, releasing the cork from the bottle. I think it's important for the future rabbis in this room to recognize the lesson from this parsha, that there are actually multiple different models for processing grief in Judaism. And while it's true that the traditional Avraham model of Shiva and Shloshim and Yortzeit works for many people to help them process grief, it isn't a comprehensive solution for everybody. And I think it's important for everybody in this room who likely will experience loss in their lives to understand that if you find that the traditional approach doesn't work for you, that alternatives are available. That being unable to shake the nagging feeling that you're doing grief wrong can be a result of sticking to Abraham's model without considering that there are complementary approaches that might do a better job of providing you with the tools to regulate and heal yourself. As many of you know, I can speak with a bit of authority about grief and the journey it takes you on. 2 years ago, in the summer between my second and third year of rabbinical school, my sister Liel died at the age of 21 after several years of being sick. It was a very slow and painful process. And I had a lot of time, as her health continued to decline, to try to do some planning ahead of time about what the right way to grieve would be if the time came. And so when it happened, like a good rule-following rabbinical student, I did everything on the official Jewish mourning checklist that goes back to Avraham. I said Kaddish, I didn't shave, I covered the mirrors, and then as soon as it was halachically permissible, I tried to get my life going again to go back to normal, so much so that I actively tried not to think about her at all. Avram moved on, so I should move on. I think other people realized that this wasn't working for me quicker than I realized that it wasn't working for me. I'll never forget, I was walking in one of the hallways between class, and one of the professors looked at me and said, "Are you okay?" And clearly she saw that something was going on in my face, but immediately I felt this wave of resentment because to say that I wasn't okay was to imply that I wasn't doing grief correctly. And so when she asked, "Are you okay?" my response was, "Of course I'm okay, Shloshim's over." Eventually I realized that the path I was on was not helping me in my goal of correctly processing grief. And so without even really thinking about it, I took on the second approach of hitbodedut, of contemplation and self-seclusion. At the time, my wife Aniko and I were living in the only place in the world more isolating and more desolate than the wilderness outside Ber L'Chai Roy. I'm speaking, of course, about the brush dorm rooms upstairs. So there I was, feeling secluded like Yitzchak, and I turned inward. Hitbodedut can be a really beautiful practice. Stripping yourself of all material comforts and being alone with your thoughts can spur growth, and it can be very meaningful, and particularly in the context of grief. For some people, it's great because it allows you the privacy to have an inner monologue and process messy feelings that you might be embarrassed to engage with publicly. But another way to say seclusion or privacy is isolation. And what I learned in my grief journey is that when I isolate myself, my inner monologue turns toxic. Some people use seclusion as an opportunity to delve deep into their feelings. I used isolation as an excuse not to. Instead, I felt anger, such intense anger, which is a secondary emotion. Anger is a secondary emotion. It's always indicative of something deeper. But because I didn't want to do the painful work of self-examination, the anger persisted and expanded, and I directed it at people who didn't deserve it. I was angry at my sister for having the temerity to get sick. I was angry at myself for not knowing how to fix her. And I was angry at whoever was closest to me in any given moment, because even I, a lifelong master of compartmentalization, could not press down the lid on my feelings forever, and eventually the pressure would build and build and build, and I would explode. This was not sustainable. Something had to change. And so I eventually came to try the third of the 3 Jewish models of processing grief, opening up the tent and letting someone else in. Not just doing my own processing, but opening up myself to someone else. And for me, that meant something that I had sworn I would never do: go to therapy. The reason I was so reluctant was that a few years prior, I had seen a therapist, and it was pretty helpful. But after about a year, the therapist and I agreed to terminate because we both thought I didn't need weekly sessions anymore. And so I felt like I had graduated from therapy, and therefore going back after my sister died was some form of unacceptable backsliding. But I'm so grateful that I did, and that I took it seriously, and that I pushed myself in the days between sessions to incorporate what we talked about, and that I kept at it for months and months. Opening myself up to myself about my feelings of sadness and anger and loss was really, really, really hard. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it saved my life. And it made me feel a new sense of kinship with Yitzchak, because in the Parsha, Yitzchak first has to open up the tent, and only then is he able to love, and only then is he able to find comfort after his mother's death. And I had to open myself up to myself to be able to find love and compassion for myself, and to be able to remember all the things that I loved and continue to love about my sister. And only then was I able to find some comfort after her death. This is my story. Everyone's grief journey is different, and some people will do better by relying on Avram's checklist to guide them through the process, and some people will best find comfort by prioritizing turning inward and engaging with themselves and their memories and self-contemplation. And some people will best be able to adjust to their new normal by opening up to a therapist or another trained professional. And many of us need some combination of these 3 models. In rabbinical school, there's a class you take about how to write sermons, and the professor would say that the most important part of the sermon are the beginning and the ending. And it's usually good to have the beginning somehow thematically tied to the ending. That's the JTS sermon model. But I really struggled to come up with an ending to this sermon because my journey is not over. I will carry my grief with me all my life. And I may in the future need to use one of these models again, and next time, number 1 or number 2 might work better than number 3. And also, my relationship with my sister is not over. I hear her voice all the time. I keep learning or remembering surprising things about her. And God willing, Aniko and I are going to have kids someday, and we're going to name one of them after her. And I'll see Liel every time I look in that kid's eyes. And for the sake of clarity, because my parents are here, I just want to emphasize this is a hypothetical at this point. What I mean is there's no easy way to wrap up a talk about something as messy as grief in a neat little bow. And when I realized that this might present a difficulty, at first I thought, oh, it'll be fine, I'll figure it out. But then I was kind of angry at myself for not coming up with a better conclusion. And then I thought, well, maybe if I have a so-so ending, it'll be okay. And then I got a little depressed because the idea of going out without a good ending was really disappointing. And then I realized it's going to be okay, because no model works for every ending. Endings are hard. That's what I've learned. All endings are hard. But the amazing thing is that the memories of everything that happened before that moment of finality, those memories can hold you and sustain you long after the ending itself has occurred. And that's because you can take those memories and use them to provide comfort for your life and meaning for your life for years after the ending itself has taken place. And when you take those lessons from those memories with you, by using whatever model works best for you, when you take the lessons from those memories with you, then you can do something remarkable and holy. You can make those memories into a blessing. The tradition at JTS is to conclude senior sermons by reciting Kaddish Rabbanan. I invite everybody to rise in body or spirit as I recite the Kaddish, which can be found on page 13 of your Sidurim. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah, be'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon u'v'yamechon u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kariv ve'imru amen. Shmei Rabbah mevorach, Le'olam u'olmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shmei dekudsha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiran be'alma ve'imru amen. Al Yisrael ve'al Rabbanan ve'al Talmidehon ve'al kol Talmidehon ve'al kol man da'askin be'oraita diva'atra hadain v'divachol atar ve'atar Yehei lahon ulachon shlama rabba, china v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arichin u'mezona revicha u'forkana mikodam avahon divishmaya v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imrumav hu b'rachamav ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru.